Times, who partners with us and the library to provide students with a free New York Times subscription and for the lunch you're eating today. Alrighty, all yours.
Thank you, Maddie, very much. Thank you. Well, you don't know how good the talk is, so I would refrain from clapping until afterwards. Because it might be a total disaster. Who knows? My name is Jay Steinmetz. I'm a professor of political science here at Fort Hays State University. I study American politics. I do public law and constitutional law, and I teach political theory as well. And it's another year of Constitution Day, and I love doing this talk and providing a sort of topical direction to understanding or thinking about some of the tension, some of the promise, some of the limitations and powers of the U.S. Constitution. And this year, I want to think about the Constitution and democracy itself. And the reason why is because we are in a political era in which there is broad agreement on both the left and right that we are in a crisis of democracy. I don't know if you believe that we have a crisis in our democracy, but many do. And it is a sentiment that, again, cuts across the sort of ideological divide. There are many on the left who believe we have a crisis of democracy of various sorts, and there are many on the right who do as well. And that's why I thought it was fitting for this talk to be sort of governed by a 1960s Hollywood movie directed by Stanley Kubrick called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Has anyone seen this movie, Dr. Strangelove? For those who haven't, I very much suggest it is a high-class political satire, and it's a wonderful political movie. It's essentially about a rogue general who thinks that the fluoride in the water is making us all communists, and in order to stop it from happening, he unleashes nuclear warfare on the Soviet Union, and a cast of clowns and ne'er-be-wells in government try to stop this from happening. So there's a nuclear crisis afoot. And this is why I think it's fitting for the talk, because we live in a crisis of democracy right now. And so instead of nuclear warfare as the crisis, our crisis is the democracy, what to do about it, what's the problem, how to interrogate our political moment when it comes to democratic rights, democratic process, free, fair, transparent elections, and all of that good stuff. So I think it's really a very good time to reflect on, for this Constitution Day, the democratic principles inherent in the Constitution. Just how democratic is this document? Is it a democratic document? What makes it a democratic document? And what makes it not a very democratic document? I'm going to present to you two sides of this debate. I'm going to present to you the side that it is indeed democratic, and that side is more historical. That's more of an originalist account of the Constitution, that on an 18th century perspective in the 1780s, this document is indeed not only very democratic, but also very populist. And I will present to you the other side of this debate, which is that this document, in theory, and this document for us today, has some serious democratic challenges to it, and maybe isn't very democratic and needs some reform. Now, I'm not necessarily siding with either of those two sides. I will provide a synthesis at the end of this talk, which goes to the subtitle, Why I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Republic. So on our way to getting there. First of all, if we're going to talk about democracy, I just want to lay down a couple of key essential points. That democratic theory requires sovereignty residing at the individual. It requires equality, political equality among citizens. And it requires norms and values that affirm those commitments of individual sovereignty and equality among citizens. And the norms and values part is really crucial and important. If you don't have a society that values, that talks about the value, that talks about the use and the good, if you will, of individual sovereignty and equality, then there's a question as to how long your democracy will survive, how long the mechanism and procedures of your democratic government will survive if we don't have commitments to it, if we don't have values to it, if we, in short, don't value freedom and equality. What good is it to have the mechanisms of democracy at our disposal? So that's just a bit of theory there, just to sort of lay out some key commitments of democracy. We might also say that democracy is self-rule. We might also say that democracy, governance in democracy, are a set of institutions that aggregate and allow for the deliberation of various different policy preferences, a redistribution or distribution of power and resources, et cetera, et cetera. So you need a degree of inclusion, a degree of transparency for a democracy to function and work. So these are the questions that I have. How democratic is the Constitution? Well, let's break it down into actually two different questions. Was the Constitution democratic for its time? And were the elements of the Constitution as the Constitution evolves? Because, of course, it does. No matter how static you want the Constitution to be, it has evolved specifically 27 times over American history. And in those instances, in that historical context, how democratic should we look at the Constitution? The other question is the theory question. Is the Constitution democratic in theory? And this really is a question about the use of this document today for us right now. How democratic is this document, and whether or not some of the elements of democracy within this Constitution can solve the key problems and crises that we face today. So for the historically based argument that the Constitution is indeed democratic, if we look at it in history, I am borrowing as inspiration a constitutional law scholar named Akil Amar from Yale University. And for those who are taking con law with me, like Georgia, we're reading this book currently right now. And for the more theory-based argument, I'm taking inspiration from a political scientist who's also at Yale, a professor emeritus named Robert Dahl, who wrote a book called How Democratic is the Constitution? ? And his answer to that is not at all. And so he's the very strong no, Akil Amar is the strong yes. And I will explain a little bit later why I'm taking a historical approach for one of those answers and more of a theoretical and contemporary approach for the other one of those answers. But before I take on either of those arguments, let me take on one different argument, which is that in the historical time, 1787, the Constitution is not very democratic. In other words, that the original intent of the framers was not very democratic. This is actually the oldest argument when it comes to democracy and the Constitution. This is what we call Beardian theory, because it's given to us by a Harvard political science and constitutional law scholar from the early 20th century named Charles Beard. And Beard made the argument that the Constitution was a conservative and reactionary document that was fashioned in the context of a rather radical and progressive era and age. That the founding, that is the Revolutionary War, and the founding document, that is the Declaration of Independence, were very radical. They espoused certain things like the equality amongst human beings, which were radical for its time. The founding also had rather radical figures like Thomas Paine, who made arguments that equality should stretch across race and gender, et cetera, and that maybe we have no need for things like religion or traditions of the past, and we should, with our Enlightenment-inspired liberal moment, fashion a very experimental and progressive government. So that's the argument, that the Revolutionary War, the founding, was rather radical, and that the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia in 1787, in response to economic dislocation, massive inflation, domestic insurrection like Shays' Rebellion, foreign intrigue like the powers of France and England, necessitated that many of the framers temper their radicalism, and that we should fashion a much more stable and conservative document that sought to pull back some of these more progressive and democratic impulses of the revolution. This is what we call the Charles Beard school of thought. And more specifically for Beard, these framers were elitists. They were protecting their own position, their own wealth, their own property, and by property I also mean slaves. And in doing so, they made a document that was elitist, if not oligarchic. A document that favored the few over the many. And implicitly, or explicitly, however obvious this is to you, means that this document is not very democratic. The Declaration of Independence is that radical document that espouses certain philosophical ideals. The Declaration of Independence is also a kind of angry document, right? It's a document of defiance. It's a classic document of dissent, if you read the Declaration of Independence. It's upset about the Crown's tyranny and the oppression of the English Crown. And it sought to boldly establish an independence that's codified and enumerated in that document. Whereas the U.S. Constitution, in its preamble and its 7 articles, is a more carefully constructed enumeration of powers and limitations, of relationships between different branches of government, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the Bill of Rights in this context. The Bill of Rights is often taken wholesale with the Constitution as though they came all together, but we know that they didn't, that the Bill of Rights comes a little bit later. Now, not that much later, but later enough that there are important historical arguments to be made, that the Bill of Rights was a compromise with the emerging anti-federalists, that the Bill of Rights provided kind of an appeasement for many of the states' writers who were concerned about the consolidation of federal power under the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So for our purposes, we're just going to look at the preamble and the 7 articles, because I think there's a stronger basis here to just analyze the historical context of this the democratic nature of this document, or just how democratic it was. So the idea that the Declaration of Independence was a radical document and the U.S. Constitution is a conservative document aligns with the idea that the Constitution is also a pro-slave document. It is a document that instantiates and entrenches slavery, slave institutions, and the slave trade. It protects the slave trade explicitly for 20 years in Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. So in that way, the Constitution is a pro-slave document without, of course, ever using the word slavery or ever using the word slave. As I pointed out in my American government class just today, the first time the U.S. Constitution uses the word slave is when? Does anyone know? Yes?
The amendment that freed the slaves?
Yeah, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery forever is the first time that slavery is used in the document, right? So by inserting euphemisms like all other persons, right, or those who are fugitives of servitude or whatever, by inserting euphemisms, the document talks about slavery directly, okay? And thus also entrenches slave interests and is a pro-slave document along these lines. I will attend to this issue as well in this talk. Slavery is not going to be a side point. It will be central to a lot of the historical discussions that we'll look at. So the challenges to Beard come a little bit later, beginning in about the 1940s or 50s with the Balin School. And the Balin School of Thought emerges in Harvard with a professor named Balin and a lot of his acolytes. They basically make the argument that elite theory does not capture many of the deeper ideas and philosophies that the framers espoused, or many of the framers espoused. That these framers were still very much inspired by Enlightenment liberal ideals, by things like Aristotle and Montesquieu's divided forms of government, that inspired by Lockean ideals of liberalism and property freedom, that they were still the same kinds of individuals, and they were still committed to the kind of experimentation and innovation of new forms of government. And as we'll see with the historical argument, there's some good, strong evidence for this. That in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the framers may have had certain conservative impulses, but many of them were still nonetheless very aware of the fact that what they were doing was very unique and new compared to the rest of the world. That what was going on in Europe at this time was decidedly different than what they were doing and experimenting or thinking about with a republican form of government here in the United States of America. So out of the Balin School comes a historian named Gordon Wood, and Gordon Wood writes a number of very important books, one of which I'll mention here, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. And in that book, Gordon Wood asks us to think about the revolution, the American Revolution, as radical, maybe for the first time. Because we often don't think of the American Revolution as radical, right? We think of the French Revolution as radical, because there is death and destruction and violence and poverty on the streets, and there is a violent overthrow of government that leads to greater violence perpetuated both by government and outside of government, et cetera, et cetera. We like to think of the French Revolution as very radical, but we often don't think about the American Revolution on the same terms. Gordon Wood asks us to reconsider, and asks us to reconsider the American Revolution as radical in its ideas, that the impact of its Enlightenment-inspired liberal ideas by classically Republican gentlemen of civic virtue like Washington and Adams and Madison indeed was a radical moment. A moment that was radical ideationally in terms of the ideas it espoused. It may not have been radical in the streets. And indeed, there's lots of historical evidence to suggest the American colonists in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s were actually pretty well off. They weren't, starving in this, colonial oppression, okay, maybe a little bit, but a stamp tax, A tax on tea, not that heavy-handed, okay? Not like the French monarchy of the 1780s in that respect. There's evidence to suggest the colonialists were fairly well-to-do. Population growing, economy, not that bad, et cetera, et cetera. So what do they have to complain about? What are the big grievances? Well, there certainly were grievances, but beyond grievances, there were Enlightenment-inspired ideas. There were ideas that there was something quintessentially new and unique about English settlement in the New World, about the American colonial experiences, that may have necessitated a new form of government, a government that was decidedly different, qualitatively different than governments over in Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. And so Gordon Wood calls us to think about the American Revolution as radical and calls us to extend the radicalism of that revolution to the second revolution, to the revolution of the Constitution and of the ratification of that document, which becomes the first large-scale democratic moment in American history, ratification. A lot of states lowered or eliminated entirely their property qualifications for ratifying the Constitution. It created a populist swell of democratic response, the ratification of the Constitution, and so constitutes its own kind of radical, maybe, and revolutionary moment, according to Gordon Wood. So all of this leads us to Akhil Amar, who is sort of writing in the context of this Balin School, of this historical account, right, that was originally there to criticize the earlier Balin School. So before I get to Amar, and before I get to what makes the Constitution democratic in a historical sense, I want to say a couple of things outright. First of all the branches have an oath to uphold the Constitution. But from this, we can infer the idea that constitutional review exists across government. If we have a duty to uphold the Constitution speaks directly to us. And if it speaks directly to us, we can speak back. And so this is an older notion of review. What I mean by constitutional review is to decide what it means, to interpret the text, to give meaning to the text. We now pretty much delegate the authority to give meaning to the Constitution to what body in particular? The Supreme Court, right? I heard, right? The Supreme Court has what we call judicial review, which is the power to interpret and give meaning to the Constitution. And we often don't think of the idea that maybe other branches of government do as well. Maybe us citizens do as well. Maybe all of us in our political community have the right to give meaning to the Constitution, right? All citizens may have a right to constitutional review. Even this gentleman right here, and I don't know if you know who this gentleman is, but this gentleman is principally responsible for the passage of the last amendment to the Constitution. This gentleman was indeed just an average citizen. In fact, he was an undergraduate in university at the University of Texas, Austin, and he took a constitutional law class. And for an assignment, this man, Gregory Watson, he was a young man back in the day when he took this class. Now he's much older. He took a class in constitutional law, and for his assignment, he advocated that a new constitutional amendment be brought out. And he picked one from the dustbin of history, one that was on the shelf, one that had been ratified from some states, but not all, one that was seriously considered by James Madison to be included amongst the Bill of Rights. Does anyone know what amendment that is? No? Well, handily enough, I have it right here for you in the text. No law varying the compensation for services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. What this says, this is our 27th Amendment to the Constitution, and what it says is Congress can give itself a pay raise, but the pay raise can only go into effect after an election, okay? This was an amendment that was considered, this language was fashioned in the 1780s, and it was considered by James Madison. Well, Gregory Watson, as a student at the University of Texas, pulls it out of the history and submits it as an assignment. He gets a C+ in the assignment, okay? C+, all right? And doesn't let the issue go. Starts petitioning Texas state government, starts petitioning others, writes lots of letters, gets involved, creates a movement. The movement sort of cascades, and eventually we have, indeed, the ratification of the 27th Amendment. Our last amendment was brought about because of this gentleman right here, and he's holding up the change in his academic record, because 25 years after that moment, the University of Texas Austin agreed to change his grade from a C+ to an A+. So there you go. This is 2 lessons. 1, the Constitution speaks directly to you, and you can speak to it, and you can change the Constitution too, just like this gentleman. He was just an undergraduate in the early 1980s. And 2, you can always have your grades changed later on, depending on what you do. So keep that in mind. I also want to call attention just very briefly, I'm not going to go into the history of Marbury v. Madison, very important Supreme Court case from 1804, which establishes judicial review for the Supreme Court, which takes that power, even though Article 3 doesn't give that power to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Marshall just took that power in Marbury v. Madison, but Jefferson's response to it, Jefferson thought he had won because Marbury didn't get his job. And he was frankly surprised that Marshall had basically said, look, we can't do anything for you, Marbury. We can't give you a writ of mandamus. Jefferson overlooked the impact of Marbury v. Madison, as so many others did at the time. And the reason why Jefferson overlooked the impact is because Jefferson firmly believed that constitutional review was the power of any officer of government, the power of anybody. That he had the power of constitutional review, and so did anyone who was in the federal government at the time. So for Chief Justice Marshall to say, this is what the Supreme Court does, we review the constitutionality of law and we give meaning to the Constitution, well, Jefferson was like, obviously, right? Everybody does. And so interesting to think about that in our time frame today, or for us to, for me to ask you all to consider seriously the idea that not only the Constitution speaks to you, but you can speak back, and that you have a voice in the Constitution. And you very well, who would have thought? I mean, you would have think that this man or anyone in that class would have thought back in the day that he would indeed be go down in history as one of the shapers of the Constitution. You can as well. And for more words of the text, I offer you this, that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And where is that in the Constitution? Who knows where that is? Any thoughts? Yeah, we're pulling out our pocket constitutions now. That's okay. Go ahead and look. Any ideas? Any guesses? Where in the Constitution are these words? Yes?
The 9th Amendment?
The 9th Amendment. Very good. Excellent. Yes, the 9th Amendment. This is my favorite place of the Constitution, by the way. And the reason why I lay it out here is because what the 9th Amendment says is that government does not know all your rights. It's not the job of government to know all your rights. And just because we enumerate, just because we write down your rights, it doesn't mean that list is finite. There is a broad base of rights out there that we get to determine as part of a political community. Rights to be treated with dignity and respect, right to friendship and love, a right to privacy, a right to our own ends in life, to determine our own meaning of life and the purpose of life. These are all deeper rights. If we live in a vibrant and rich liberal civil society, that means that we believe freedom is much bigger and much deeper than the government writing stuff down and telling us what our rights are and what our freedoms are, okay? And so this place in the Constitution, the 9th Amendment, also calls attention to this idea that the Constitution is not only speaking to us, it's inviting us to speak back. It's inviting us to have a conversation. It's inviting us to determine, okay, what are some of our rights, right? Do we have a right to health care? Not currently, but maybe we should. That's a conversation we could have, right? That right to dignity, what does that mean? How far does that extend? Where does that go, right? This is the basis of a political conversation that we can have about this document and its meaning to us. The Constitution speaks to us all. So what makes it democratic? Let's look at some of these historical arguments of the document. First of all, the preamble. The preamble is actually a moment directly where the Constitution is speaking about us, saying we, and immediately is giving indication, grammatically. The moment you read the Constitution, the first word, we, has already included you, right? You're now inside. You're in the club. You're in the group. We the people, right? And so it calls us, it reminds us that we are all here, and now we are speaking. You are not just the reader, in other words, if we take the text of the preamble very seriously. And by the way, the text of the preamble should probably be taken more seriously, because what makes the preamble any less law than Article 1, Article 2, Article 3? Nothing.
There's no indication that the preamble is not the text of law, just like any other aspect of the Constitution, right? The preamble is law. And the preamble, right away, the textual meaning of it is telling us that you are not just a reader, you are actually also a speaker of the Constitution and the relationship between the Republic and the people in this country. And people, indeed, people of a more flattened world, land everywhere, of growing population, okay? The growth rates, if you look at demographic history of the United States, the growth rates of the United States, in particular, let's take from the 1780 to 1820, immigration from abroad was actually very low. The numbers were very small. Most of the population growth was internal population growth at that time. Huge waves of migration, mostly westward, huge population increases, and the idea of sort of easy land. Now, it is an idea, and the reality is that, yes, while land may have been easy, it also, a lot of land was taken from others. And we also had conflicts within various different indigenous nations over land, over rights, over what it meant to have a political community, et cetera, et cetera. So those things are obviously very much with us that we have to be attentive to and aware of. But it was indeed a rather flattened world compared to Europe. What do I mean by a flattened world? I mean that while there are hierarchies, and in the South, in the southern states, where the institution of slavery not only takes root but grows, and grows very perniciously over the decades, to become very, very large indeed. The institutions of slavery by the 1840s and 50s were extremely large, over 4 million slaves, fed into every aspect of Southern life, et cetera, et cetera. In the South, society was more hierarchical, more vertically orientated. That is, the masters above and the servants below is how you defined your place in society, okay? Much less so in the northern states. I'll get that for you. Much less so in the northern states, where there was more of a flattened society. Even in the north, though, there were still hierarchies. But when you compare this to Europe, and when you compare this to other societies in the world, it is no doubt the case that we had some robustly flattened aspects of our society. Very competitive, roughly horizontal individuals competing in a marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. All of the words of Tocqueville in Democracy in America. If you've read Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a French aristocrat who came and visited America and was both horrified and fascinated by how flattened and democratic and robust and crazy and busy Americans seemed to be. That all Americans had a job and they were always going from one place to another. And that whole families would move up and locate and sell their farm and move westward, and people were all moving around, and et cetera, et cetera. And things looked decidedly democratic and flattened from Tocqueville's perspective. This is all very much the case. And what I'm saying here, what I'm indicating, is that the text may have mirrored, if we take this text from the 1780s and we say that this text is very democratic for its time, in many ways it mirrored a democratic society. Because democracy is not just about governance, about mechanisms of democracy, about elections, et cetera, et cetera. It's also to what extent is our society and culture democratic, right? Do we have a democratic spirit? And that spirit is not just obviously about voting. It's about getting out and protesting. It's about dissent. It's about disobedience. It's about running for office ourselves. It's about attending meetings. It's about signing petitions. It's about assembly. It's about speech. It's about press. This is the sort of nuts and bolts of a democratic society. And when we look back in history, we can see that American society, with all its faults and all of its problems, had a lot of this vibrant, rich, deep, competitive, conflicted democratic society as well. Population more than doubles from 1780 to 1800. The scramble west of squatters and speculators. We have a rich, long history of squatting in this country. That goes all the way through the American West. And what I mean by squatters are, in many cases, folks, whole families, who would clear part of the forest, build a house, start agriculture and cultivation of the ground, et cetera, et cetera. What I mean by speculators are often the financial or pecuniary interests who were at loggerheads with the squatters. There are stories of bankers in New York buying 1 million acres of land in Ohio that they've never seen. And the moment they go out to Ohio, which would be the frontier at around the 1790s or 1800s, they would see that much of the land that they bought was already occupied by various different people. There were competing land titles or conflicted titles. That was a real problem out on the frontier. This is one of the reasons why the Lincoln family, Abraham Lincoln's family, when he was a kid, moved from Kentucky first to Indiana and then Illinois, because Kentucky had notoriously conflicted land titles. And every time you staked a claim and said, I own this land, there'd be 3 other people who said, hey, that's funny, I own the same piece of land. So, there was a lot of haphazard migration and movement and demographic growth in the new America. All this suggests a very robustly active and democratic society. There were also tons of political opportunities in territorial governments for people on the make, for people who are not born of aristocratic wealth or means, people who could, pack up shop, move further west out into a frontier and growing town, and suddenly become a leader of that town, become maybe even territorial governor or governor of a state one day. These stories abound throughout the American experience as the frontier moves westward and as democratic migration continues apace. In the words of Omar, a small knot of men drafting secretly in Philadelphia understood full well that the American people would have the last word on the ultimate fate of the American Constitution, that the American people themselves. So let's look at some of the very details of the text that make it democratic. Citizenship, state residency, age requirements of Article 1. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch of government, right? First of all, there may have been property qualifications to vote, but there were no property qualifications for running for a House seat or a Senate seat. That was a very democratic idea at the time. Anybody could run for a House seat or a Senate seat as long as you filled the state residency and age requirements. But if we look at those state residency and age requirements as well, we can see some democratic nature to those. Citizenship qualification in Article 1 can serve in the House after 7 years of citizenry, and you can serve in the Senate after 9 years. What this intended to do was open up the ability to represent to immigrants from all over the world, attracting the best and the brightest from Europe, like French Huguenots, Protestants from France, who were not allowed to settle in Quebec and New France, but could settle certainly here in the New World, gave them opportunities that they couldn't find elsewhere. Some states and some individuals at the convention sought even more welcoming qualifications. There were many voices who wanted to do away with any citizenship requirements so that it would attract even more immigrants to serve in government and be part of the American experiment. State residency requirements as well could be argued to be a democratic response in response to a lot of these speculators, absentee landowners, carpetbaggers from other states, rich and privileged and elites from New York who go out to Ohio and then because they're rich and privileged feel like they deserve a place in government when they didn't really earn it. So state residency requirements required for people to live in that locale for a longer period of time in order to build a reputation that they could use to advance their political career. Age requirements tended to restrict elite classes, not the middling classes, not the middle classes. The elite classes, if you were the son of someone politically connected, you couldn't just immediately get into government. You had to wait a while. You had to test your mettle a little bit. And at the time at which the time it took for you to develop your own career, you also had many of the middling classes, first generation liberal arts educated, people who were on the make and on the move, at basically the same level that you were at. Because you both had a period of time for which you had to cultivate a political career, cultivate a reputation that could put you in government and in office. So age requirements could be understood as being democratic as well. Salaries democratized the right to serve in government. This mitigated against both the tendency of politics to be dominated by the rich and the tendency toward bribery, right? If we had a government that didn't get paid at all, our government would clearly be run by millionaires to a greater extent than it is today. And so if you look at the salaries for House representatives and senators in the 1790s and 1800s, it's a generous salary. In fact, it's much more so than compared to the salaries that they take and the cost of living today. And so that encouraged lots of different folks to get involved in government. Think about this in our state governments. This is actually a very big problem, congressional pay in our state governments. Does anyone know what a representative in the Kansas House or the Kansas Senate makes a year to legislate in Topeka? Yeah, Henry?
It's like $23,000.
Yeah, you can't live on it, that's for sure. And so what that means is that if you want to be a representative in the Kansas State House or the Kansas Senate, the likelihood of you being independently wealthy, or the necessity, is pretty high. And so that skews the representatives we have in Topeka toward older, more well-to-do, likely retired population, not a lot of younger folks. I had this conversation with our first Asian American representative in the Kansas House in Kansas history, Ree Shu, who's early 30s, has a young daughter, and is like, I don't know if I can do this for very much longer, because I gave up a job that paid me over $100,000 a year to do this, to legislate for the people, and to try to govern. So that's something seriously to consider. Also, the idea of time, place, manner in Article 1, meaning elections. Clockwork elections, right? Elections that were precisely timed, was a departure from the haphazard norm that dominated in Europe, where elections were kind of just snap elections, and elections would often be dictated by the powers that be, right? Tin pot dictators around the world still do this today, by the way. When political environment is favorable to them, they'll be like, oh, let's have a snap election, let's do something about it. Political environment is not favorable, election's canceled, weather's bad, we'll wait a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. But in this country, the first Tuesday of every November's even year, we have an election, either a midterm election or a presidential election. And it makes it hard for political power to game that system, because it runs like clockwork over and over again. This was unique for the time. It provided a kind of level playing field and held government accountable. And that's one of the rationales behind it in Article 1. Okay, so the number of representatives in Congress. The exact size of the House was a major tension point in the convention itself. How big is this House going to be? The standard way of thinking about this is that the larger the House, the more representative it is, i.e. the more democratic it is, but then the more inefficient it might be, right? Whereas a smaller House might be less representative, less democratic, but more efficient. There'd be less cooks in the kitchen, if you will. So the populace of the Constitutional Convention wanted a larger House, those who were more pro-democratic, but so too did Hamilton, and Hamilton was no friend of, he was one of the more, the critics of populist democracies, et cetera, at the convention. So it bounded a couple of different disparate people together advocating for a larger House. Of course, those who were elites in state government and had powers in state government, states' writers, and small states more generally speaking, like New Jersey, wanted a smaller House that would be a level the playing field for their states against the more populous and larger states. Hamilton's plea for a larger House failed because Hamilton kind of sullied himself in the convention advocating for some kind of elected monarchy and talking about how well aristocracies rule, and his word at the convention did not really carry as much weight as it subsequently would as the principal author of the Federalist Papers and Treasury Secretary in the Washington administration. He becomes very influential later on. But in the convention, not as much, and his plea fails. This is one of the few moments in which General Washington, who rarely spoke during the convention, actually speaks up. He intervenes and sides with the larger House. And in fact, it was originally, in the original draft that they were working on at the convention at that time, they had allocated for a smaller House. The smudge remains on the original parchment, and the changing of the number to a larger House was added there. So we got a more democratic House. We got a House which, for example, House Representative had no more than 30,000 people as their constituents. The ratio today is one of the largest in the world. We have one House representative for every 747,000 people. That's what a constituency is for a House representative. That is one of the largest ratios in the world, comparatively. And so calls into question the real democratic nature of our government if our representatives have such large constituencies. How are they able to actually reach those people and talk to those people? Imagine the work that they put into just to reach the concerns of 747,000 people. I believe the smallest ratio is Iceland, which incidentally has the oldest legislature in the world, and a representative has a constituency of about 3,500 people in Iceland. Almost possible to read every letter and every email from your constituents. I do want to talk about slavery a little bit. all other persons, one of the darker corners of our Constitution, this euphemism referring to slavery, and of course the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 principle, or the 3/5 clause was a principal force in radicalizing slavery in Washington, strengthening the slave institutions in the South. The document, according to Amar, the argument here is that it is pro-slavery. It's both pro-slavery and pro-democracy, and the Constitution radicalizes the institutions of slavery over time. The principled abolition argument, as I always remind my students for the 3/5 clause, was not, we might look at the 3/5 clause and be like, oh, how inhumane that they're treated as less than persons. Maybe we should be humane and add slaves as 5/5. But no, the principled abolition argument was that we ought to count for representation purposes in the House of Representatives, because slaves are not really represented. They don't get any rights conferred upon them. They're not really represented well. They're treated as property. They should be counted as 0/5 for purposes of apportioning the House of Representatives. The effect here is that there are fewer persons per representative, however. And if we look at that itself can be an example of how the document is both pro-slave and pro-democratic. Because a 3/5 representative, and let's even say if it were a 5/5, they were counted as whole persons, that would mean that enumeration would include more people within the political community. And on paper, as a technicality, if you will, one might make an argument that created maybe more democracy, just in terms of numbers. But of course, we don't work in technicalities, we work in history, and the cruelties and barbarities of slavery were obviously antithetical to the notion that any of those human beings who were treated as property would be respected as members of a democratic community. Modern students are trained to think that the Constitution is neither pro-democratic nor pro-slavery. You may have heard both those arguments, that the Constitution, has anyone ever heard of someone say that we live in a republic and not a democracy, right? Or you've been taught in high school often that the Constitution is neutral on slavery, or is a series of compromises on the issue of slavery, and that democracy itself was a compromise within the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the other side of this argument is that these are not compromises, and that it is not neutral, and that in fact the Constitution is both pro-democracy and pro-slave. Is this a contradiction? Slavery and democracy, both hand in hand? Well, if it is a contradiction, it's one that lies at the heart of America's story of enfranchisement and exclusion, okay? That enfranchisement, the ability to confer upon those voting rights and political rights, goes hand in hand with marginalization, exclusion, nativism, xenophobia, et cetera, et cetera. Democracy and its growth cannot be separated from slavery, from native indigenous genocide, from exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. And if actually we look at several different moments in history, we see that democratizing moments in American history often occur alongside waves of exclusion and nativism and xenophobia, and that's not really a contradiction. Or that's not a coincidence, rather. The founding emboldens slave interests. It also emboldens the abolitionists. First abolition societies in America are during the Revolutionary War. In the Jacksonian era, where we have the enfranchisement or the universal white male suffrage, where white men who did not own property could suddenly vote, that went hand in hand with closing off black property franchise in northern states. There were states in the north where if free black men qualified for the property qualifications, they could vote, and they did in numbers in Connecticut, in Delaware, et cetera, et cetera. But the moment the Jacksonian Revolution came, and white propertyless men were now included amongst the voting class, those states, Delaware, Connecticut, New York, other states, suddenly racially closed off and wrote in race into the state constitutions and into voting requirements, and suddenly said, no, free blacks cannot vote. Blacks cannot vote entirely. If we're going to include propertyless white men, then we're going to close off those free blacks who would have qualified for the property. And so we see in the Jacksonian era exclusion and the increase of the franchise going hand in hand. Also, gone in the antebellum South during slavery are these kind of racial intimacies that had existed on the plantation and replaced it with both greater democratization of the Reconstructive era and the entrenchment of segregation, of segregating the races in the Reconstructive era. Suddenly now free blacks can vote, and they did in very large numbers throughout the South. For a period of time, South Carolina had a predominantly black House legislature, right? But it also went in hand with instituting segregation. What I mean by biracial intimacies in the antebellum South was that there wasn't much codified segregation in slave South America. There were, in fact, a number of intimacies that worked across racial lines. Children of slave masters were weaned and cared for by black slaves, and there was love and bond that existed between those individuals. Slaves worked directly in the home, in the kitchen, in the dining room, in the bedroom of white slave owners. And there were a number of complicated intimacies that had developed. And if you're interested in at least one individual in their story, look no further than Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln, who was raised in a very privileged slave-owning household in Lexington, Kentucky, and fell in love with the woman who had raised her, the black slave who had raised her, and later repatriated back to Liberia in Africa, was one of the many who migrated back to Liberia, or back to Africa to Liberia, and they wrote letters back and forth to each other for much of their lives. And she maintained a very intimate, familial relation with the slave woman who had raised her. And so gone are those things. Both with greater democratization comes also segregation in the South, et cetera, et cetera. I could go into so much more detail, but I have to move on there. So, and now we look at the powers of Congress from Article 1, Section 8. We see, the challenge here of the framers in 1787 was to find the middle ground, the sweet spot between a dangerously strong government, like a monarchy or an English parliament, or a dangerously weak one, like the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress. The first government of America was notoriously too weak. So they needed something not so strong, but also not so weak. They needed something in the middle. And Article 1, Section 8, one of the most important elements of the Constitution, indicates this very difficult negotiation between not too strong, not too weak. Some of the things that I'll highlight that are democratic in nature: post offices and post roads amongst the express powers. You've heard me harp on this if you've taken a class with me. I love to talk about the post offices and the post roads and how this was high technology for the time and allowed for commoners to send letters to other commoners and allowed commoners to send letters to the President of the United States or rich and powerful elite people, and how unique this was to the world. Right, in Europe, nobility and aristocrats could send messenger pigeons to other aristocrats, but there was no way for communication to work across the broad swath of the public like what was established in the express powers of the U.S. Constitution with post offices and post roads. It used to be we were very, very proud of our post offices in this country, and the Postmaster General was a very important executive position. Not so much, unfortunately, today, but it indicates a very populist democratic element of our Constitution to provide and guarantee for that communication on top of our Article 1 rights of speech, of press, of petition, of assembly. We have this ability to communicate all of our ideas across the public. Also mentioned the very next clause, I believe, in Article 1, Section 8 is intellectual property. For sciences and useful arts, that government should provide the freedom to express those ideas for limited times, right? And provides intellectual property for patents, inventors, and also for artists, musicians, novelists, et cetera, and is one of the first expressions of intellectual property in the world in the U.S. Constitution. We are getting dangerously close to time limits, so I'm going to move on. I'm not going to talk about the necessary and proper clause or the Electoral College, and I'm going to move on to the undemocratic elements. I'm going to give you the other side of the argument. And I'm sorry that this is unfair, that I've spent so much time on the Democratic side and less on the undemocratic side. But let me just give you the basic breakdown, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into what we might mean by democracy. First of all, the Fugitive Slave Clause. Complete violation of free soil law, not very democratic. Prohibiting Congress from banning the slave trade, Article 1, Section 9. Not very democratic at all. Basically, it says that Congress can't even pass a law, even if the public wanted to. and push Congress to pass a law to ban the slave trade. They couldn't. This indicates a check on a democratic body, the Congress, to pass law, a check from a very minority interest. The slaveocracy was always a minority interest. I love to say this fact. I've said it multiple times. You've heard me say this already. But in the slaveholding South, white men who did not own slaves were more numerous and populous than white men who did own slaves. The slaveocracy really was an oligarchy. That's in every state except South Carolina. Only South Carolina had more white slave-owning men than white non-slave-owning men. And so the slaveocracy was a minority. The South becomes a minority. 49% of the population was in the South in 1800. By 1840, that number becomes 37, 38%. So there's a dwindling minority of the Southern population in general, but an even more dwindling minority of slave masters and slave owners. And of course, that coincides with the growth of slave institutions. Slavery is growing more pernicious, even as the number of slave masters dwindles fewer and fewer and fewer. This is what some of the things that create the crisis of the 1850s that lead to the Civil War. The Constitution does not guarantee suffrage. Nowhere in the Constitution does it guarantee suffrage until the 15th Amendment and until the 19th Amendment. And so suffrage is not there. It leaves it up to the states. It allows the states to basically run their elections and determine what suffrage is. That's not very democratic. Choosing the president. The Electoral College, this kind of complicated mechanism for selecting the president, the Electoral College, brings about, frankly, the reality of wasted votes, which I'm sure many of you feel, the wasted votes that happen in the Electoral College. If you are a liberal progressive in Kansas or a conservative Republican in California, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about wasted votes. There's not a real strong incentive for you to vote for the president other than to be part of the big show, because there's a feeling that your votes don't count for very much if you're voting for Donald Trump in California or if you're voting for Joe Biden in Kansas. And the reality is you feel like your votes don't count for very much because they don't count for very much. They are wasted votes because of the Electoral College, and that doesn't feel very democratic to most people. If we went toward a nationwide popular election for the selection of the president, immediately, without any reflection or thinking about it, that feeling of wasted votes would go away. Every vote would count for the same measure and of equal weight and importance in enumerating those votes and selecting the president. Okay, so choosing the senators before 1913, that's the 17th Amendment. Prior to the 17th Amendment, choosing the senators, they were appointed by state legislatures. That's not very democratic. That brings about a lot of patronage and corruption and insider politics, et cetera, et cetera. And what a lot of people point to as one of the more egregious undemocratic elements of the Constitution, equal representation in the Senate, which of course James Madison hated as one of the main authors of the Constitution and a proponent of democracy. Madison really did not like this idea that you could be as small as Rhode Island and still have the same number of senators as a state like California, or at that time Virginia, the most popular state. And that doesn't seem very democratic either. How about judicial power? The Constitution doesn't limit judicial power to strike down law. It basically gives wide authority for the judiciary to strike down law passed by popular legislatures. And who are these judges who strike down law? Lifetime appointees, right? Not elected by the people. That doesn't sound very democratic. And lastly, this is what I'll rest on for the rest of the talk, is majoritarianism. The idea that candidates in majoritarianism, codified in our Constitution, candidates vie for single seats in winner-take-all elections. We also call this the winner-take-all system, or the first-past-the-post system, right? This leads to two dominant parties, or two-party system. It also leads to majority governing, okay? So the majority party in Congress gets to govern. The minority can stop some things from happening, but don't have a lot of power, right? We have majority rule in this country. The majority party gets to rule. That comes from our majoritarian elections. We elect single candidates who vie for a seat. The loser gets nothing, zero. The winner gets everything. Even if, in many cases, you don't win a majority of votes, even if you just win a plurality of votes, say you win like 49%, but you don't get over 50, you still win 100% of the power that comes with that seat. In most elections, there are exceptions, like Georgia, you have runoffs if you get a plurality but not a majority, but in most cases. So this leads us to Robert Dahl's critique of the American Constitution as democratic. First of all, Dahl wants to evaluate on some terms. He's like, okay, what do we mean by democracy and how are we going to evaluate it? Let's evaluate the Constitution along these lines, okay, along 5 different lines. How well does it maintain the democratic system, okay? How well does it protect fundamental democratic rights? How well does it ensure democratic fairness among citizens? How well does it encourage the formation of democratic consensus? So how well does it bring about consensus? And lastly, how well does it provide a democratic government that's effective in solving problems? So in short, stability, protection of rights, how fair is it? How well does it bring about consensus? And how effective is it, right? Those 5 characteristics for evaluating the Constitution. And when we look at proportional systems and we compare it to our majoritarian system, we don't get good grades, according to Robert Dahl, right? So when we compare the US to 22 other democracies, we see that most other democracies have a proportional system of one kind or another. Our majoritarianism is unique. Not totally unique, but is a minority when we look out in the world, especially when we look at so-called advanced Western democracies, whatever you want to call them. The differences in stability and rights, when we look at the first 2, protection of rights and stability, there's not much of a difference. We can't attribute that to majoritarianism or proportionality. We do a pretty good job, but so do lots of other proportional systems do a good job at providing stability. This is the oldest constitution in the world, the US Constitution, right? That sounds pretty stable to me. Or providing for rights. We have a very strong Bill of Rights, and we have a rights-based system, and we have stronger rights in a lot of cases than a lot of other countries. And I could go into more detail, but I'll kind of just leave it at that. So when it comes to rights and it comes to stability, not much can be said. But when we apply the concepts of fairness and consensus and effectiveness, there's 3 other characteristics. We see some discernible variation between proportional and majoritarian systems. Now, just to throw out here, proportionality is the idea that a percentage of seats is won by a party, not a single individual. And that percentage of seats won by a party roughly mirrors the percentage of the percentage of votes that they win in an election roughly mirrors the percentage of seats they win in a parliament or in a legislature, right? So you're voting for a party, not an individual candidate. And that party can get 15% of the vote, then they get about 15% of the power in government, okay? This leads to multi-party systems, and most importantly, for our purposes in thinking about this, it leads to coalition governing, not majority governing. In proportional systems, the parties all have to get together and figure out what the coalition is going to be. What is the coalition that's going to get over 50% in the legislature that will actually be able to govern? So sometimes the coalitions look a little odd. Sometimes you got right-wing political parties joining with green parties and whatever to form a coalition. If the coalition breaks down, you got to have new elections, or you've got to form a new coalition, right? But it's coalition governing, not majority governing. In our system, the majority party governs. It doesn't have to provide any coalitions. We have informal coalitions like, the Tea Party, Freedom Caucus and the Republican Party in Congress, or the Squad, the Progressives and the Democratic Party, right? But they're not formal coalitions. They're not formal parties. It's an informal block of, representatives. Coalition governing is very different in that respect. So what we're doing when we're evaluating these democracies on proportional and majoritarian grounds, we're really evaluating coalition rule versus majority rule. Which one's more effective, okay? So virtually nobody says that majoritarianism is somehow fairer than proportionality. Nobody questions this, no serious scholar. Proportionality seems on the surface to be obviously fairer. Because when 9% of the vote is cast for whatever group or party, and that party gets 9% of the power, that sounds a lot fairer than a candidate losing, getting 46% of the vote but losing everything, okay? So nobody really questions the fairness of proportionality when compared to majoritarianism. So that leaves us with consensus and effectiveness. Does majoritarianism bring about greater consensus? Is it more effective? Okay? Here's the thing. One of the criticisms that's often brought out about proportionality and coalition governing is that it's not very stable. It's unstable. You look at countries like Italy, very hard time forming coalitions. They're always bickering and fighting. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with the Italian culture. Did I say that out loud? But the coalitions are always bickering and fighting. They're always falling apart and then rebuilding and reconstituting themselves. There's always new governments that are coming out in Italy. So maybe, because of the stability of majoritarianism and majoritarian governing, it provides for greater consensus because there's one party, majority party ruling, and it gives a clear mandate for action in majoritarianism, and therefore is more effective. But when we look in the weeds and we look at the details and we look at some comparisons, we see that majoritarianism has problems even with consensus and effectiveness. And let's look at just 3 examples very, very briefly and quickly. I'll just run through these very quickly. Netherlands, divided and insulated society among 4 distinct groups: Protestants, Catholics, liberals, and socialists, for hundreds of years. These differences were bridged by government reform toward a more consensus-building and inclusive system of representation right around the 1910s. It wasn't really about democracy. It was about bringing all the stakeholders together and forcing them to deliberate and to arrive at certain consensus. The Dutch governments today continue to opt for inclusion and consensus rather than majoritarian rule. They favor this. They like bringing in their opponents and having them be a part of the problem-solving things that are going on in government. Switzerland, famously, notoriously fractured, right? It's a confederation. You've got German, French, Italian cantons that fused together in the 1100s, I think, but are still very different from one another. They're relatively homogenous within those communities, and they're very different from one another in terms of language and culture, et cetera, outside of those cantons. There's also a Catholic-Protestant divide. In other words, we have a very balkanized society, Switzerland, okay? Very fractured, different society. But in 1959, pragmatism, common sense, national identity forged a proportional system that shares governing among these groups and brings about pretty good consensus. Sweden, here's the opposite of Switzerland. Sweden's a very highly homogenous society and people with long-established consensus politics, but a relatively recent democracy. They've only been democratic since around 1917 or so. There's a long-standing tradition of consensus that didn't necessitate democracy in Sweden. Hundreds of years it goes back. It's like codified into literature and fairy tales and art and culture in Sweden that consensus is leadership, that real leaders bring legitimacy by bringing their opponents into power and sharing power with them. That's what has been codified in Sweden for a very long time. So it's not winning against your opponents and getting leverage with a mandate to rule. It's sharing power with your opponents. That's what it means to be a leader in Sweden. So it's not about democracy again. It's really about the culture that does so. So in the end, these things, proportional, actually does bring about some degree of consensus and effectiveness, and our majoritarianism has some serious problems, argues Robert Dahl. You're coming up to remind me that we're getting close to time, right? That's what I thought. So let me just skip ahead to how I learned to stop worrying. Amar and Dahl may take very different approaches to understanding the Constitution. Amar, it's historical. It's originalist account. Whereas Dahl, it's theory-based, it's contemporary. It's like, how well does this document work for us today in a very practical way? We're not comparing the Constitution's democracy across strictly similar categories. But I think that's all for the better. I think we're doing well by looking at one argument historically and the other contemporary and theoretical. Shouldn't we take the strongest argument on its own terms? The Constitution is pro-democracy in its historical original account, and that serves as a point of reflection. It reminds us to reflect on the past and to bring it to bear in the present. Whereas the Constitution does have some serious democratic flaws, maybe not anti-democracy, but has some flaws, democratic flaws, in theory, and requires a pragmatic assessment of efficacy. And maybe it's the case that Amar's populist reading of the original intent in the Constitution can serve as inspiration so that we can see the voyage of the Constitution as one that calls us to revise, to democratize, to innovate, and to see our political community not just what it was in the past and what its crisis is in the moment, but what its promise is for the future. Thank you.
I want to first thank Dr. Steinmetz for presenting for us today, and I want to thank all of you for coming. You guys are free to leave. There's trash cans on your way out. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.